Today, we're taking a look at 4 generations of AMD and NVIDIA GPUs battling at the $300 US price point to see how things have progressed over the years. And recently, I have accused both brands of stagnant performance at this price range, but we have seen some of the best gains in years coming out of this latest generation. So there are positive signs for budget gamers, and you know what else you can be positive about? Today's video is brought to you by Arctic and their return to the case market with the Xtender VG eATX mid-tower case featuring vertical GPU support. Designed to deliver maximum performance while still offering a visually impressive design, the Xtender VG is perfect for high-end builds that you want to show off. The panoramic glass panels perfectly showcase your hardware, while the pre-installed high-performance P12 and P14 Pro ARGB fans make sure it all stays cool. Inside, you can fit a pair of 420mm radiators and graphics cards as long as 360mm in either a vertical or horizontal configuration. The Xtender VG is available in white, black, and even a mirror black finish. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so going back 5 years now, almost 6 actually, we have the Radeon RX 5600 XT, which was very late to the party. It arrived about a year after NVIDIA's RTX 2060, but it would end up competing with the RTX 2060 because NVIDIA reduced the pricing from $350 down to $300 once the mid-range Radeon GPU finally arrived for $280 US. The 5600 XT wasn't a bad product, but at such a small discount, it didn't wow me like the 5700 XT did. Performance was similar to the RTX 2060, but you missed out on the ever-evolving DLSS support and ray tracing, though the latter feature was pretty useless in my opinion on RTX 2060 for a number of reasons, mostly due to the limited VRAM and weak overall GPU performance. Still, I was mostly satisfied with what the RTX 2060 had to offer, but noted that the 5600 XT was a decent effort from AMD, despite the release hiccups with the VBIOS and all that fun. With the next generation, AMD and NVIDIA were drunk on the cryptocurrency boom, selling quite literally anything they could pump out, and as a result, AMD didn't even bother to compete on price, and as usual, they were late to the party, releasing their Radeon RX 6600 some 8 months after NVIDIA's GeForce RTX 3060. Both products featured an MSRP of $330 US, though neither sold for that price due to the demand from cryptocurrency miners. So the generation was a bit of a bust, but once demand cooled off in mid-2022, pricing crashed from the extreme highs of 2021, where this humble 8GB RX 6600 was somehow selling for up around $600 US. But after that insanity, it did quickly end up selling below MSRP. Having misread the demand, NVIDIA and in particular AMD had huge inventories to clear out, and AMD was still scrambling to sell off RDNA 2 GPUs well into the release of their next generation RDNA 3 GPUs, so the Radeon 7000 series, which came the following year. And this brings us to one of the more disappointing product series in recent generations. The mining boom was mostly over, and while AI was starting to pick up, things hadn't got too crazy yet. Still, despite that, AMD, and in particular NVIDIA, had gotten a real taste for those fat margins, and weren't ready to go back to the old ways just yet. So for budget gamers, that meant very poor value products that offered very little in the way of upgrades. The RTX 4060 was $300 US and still packed 8GB of VRAM, while the RX 7600 was no better, arguably worse if anything. And that brings us to today. The demand for GPUs has only increased thanks to AI, so budget gamers are still getting 8GB GPUs. But with the previous generation being so bad, what we've ended up with doesn't seem so bad. Well, relative to the previous generation anyway. The fact of the matter is, $300 US still only buys you an 8GB GPU. So, let's see how these various Radeon and GeForce GPUs compare in a range of games. I'm keen to look back at the competition over the past 5 years or so, and as usual, for all this GPU testing I'm using the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D to help reduce the CPU bottleneck. And I'm pairing with DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. Okay, let's get into it. First up, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and we'll start with the basic preset, which has been tested at 1080p and 1440p. Going back to the 5600 XT and RTX 2060 battle, we see that in this example, performance was very similar, which probably doesn't bode all that well for the Radeon GPU, as this title tends to favour AMD graphics cards. The following generation, we have the RX 6600 and RTX 3060. Again, performance is very close, particularly at 1440p. At 1080p, the RX 6600 was 10% faster, so a reasonable performance increase there. And the margin grows with the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 matchup. Here the Radeon GPU is 16% faster at 1080p and 12% faster at 1440p. Again, this game does tend to favour Radeon GPUs, but even so, a solid win here for the 7600. Now, getting up to date, we have the 9060 XT 8GB and RTX 5060, and boy does the 5060 get smashed in this example. The Radeon GPU is 40% faster at 1080p, and an even larger 46% faster at 1440p. The RTX 5060 is only able to roughly match the RX 7600, so like I said, not a great title for Nvidia. Switching up to the Extreme preset changes things quite a bit. Most of these GPUs can't average over 60 FPS at 1440p. In fact, the 9060 XT was the only model to do so, beating the RTX 5060 by a 41% margin. At 1080p, the 9060 XT was an insane 56% faster than the RTX 5060, and oddly, the new budget Blackwell GPU was just 6% faster than the RTX 4060, making it quite a bit slower than the RX 7600. So let's move on to check out another game. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077, and again, I'll start with the low quality preset data. At 1080p, the RTX 2060 beat the 5600 XT by 8%, and then 14% at 1440p, so an easy win here for Nvidia. Nvidia also got the W for the next generation, with the RTX 3060 easily beating the RX 6600 by a 10% margin at 1080p, and then 13% at 1440p. Then we have the RTX 4060 versus RX 7600 matchup, and here the GeForce GPU was 14% faster at 1080p, and then 5% faster at 1440p. But where AMD manages to blow Nvidia away is with this current generation, as here we see that the 9060 XT 8GB is much faster than the RTX 5060 in this title, delivering 21% greater performance at 1080p, and then 18% better performance at 1440p. In fact, the 1% lows of the 9060 XT roughly match the average frame rate of the RTX 5060, so it is a big win here for the Radeon GPU. Switching to the high preset changes things a little bit. That said, the RTX 2060 still easily beats the 5600 XT with 10% greater performance at 1080p and then 18% greater performance at 1440p, though both are now well below 60 FPS. The RTX 3060 heavily gaps the RX 6600, delivering a massive 25% increase at 1080p and then 31% at 1440p, so no contest there for the GeForce GPU. The RTX 4060 and RX 7600, on the other hand, are very evenly matched. We're looking at near identical performance at 1440p, though the GeForce GPU was 8% faster at 1080p. Then with the latest generation, we're looking at much more even performance with the high preset. The 9060 XT 8GB was a mere 5% faster at 1080p and then 10% faster at 1440p, which is a reasonable margin, but not nearly as impressive as some of the previously seen margins. Now onto Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered. Starting with the medium quality preset, the RTX 2060 still easily beats the 5600 XT at 1080p, delivering 10% greater performance, and then 8% stronger performance at 1440p. The RX 6600 is also outclassed. Here the RTX 3060 was 12% faster at 1080p, and then a massive 18% faster at 1440p. The RTX 4060 versus RX 7600 battle is much more even, with similar performance seen at 1080p, and then just a 7% performance advantage for the GeForce GPU at 1440p with similar 1% lows. Now, the RTX 5060 does fare better with the high quality settings, but even so, the 9060 XT 8GB was still 12% faster at 1080p and then 17% faster at 1440p, so a pretty convincing win here for AMD. Okay, switching to the very high preset causes some issues for these GPUs, as under these conditions, even at 1080p, the game requires more than 10GB of VRAM. Now, you might be wondering how the 9060 XT 8GB avoids the horrific performance seen from most other models, the RTX 3060 being the only exception as it does have 12GB of VRAM. And the reason for this is down to the PCI Express interface. Whereas the other budget GPUs have 8 lanes, the 9060 XT gets the full 16 lanes, doubling the bandwidth to the system memory, and this really helps performance when the VRAM is exceeded. It's still not an ideal scenario, but as a result, the 9060 XT 8GB works, whereas the RTX 5060 is a stuttery mess, along with the RX 7600, RTX 4060, RX 6600, 5600 XT, and RTX 2060. Next up, we have Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and we'll start with the medium quality preset. In this title, the 5600 XT gets destroyed by the RTX 2060 as the GeForce GPU is 19% faster at 1080p and 13% faster at 1440p. As expected, the RX 6600 also gets mugged by the RTX 3060. This time Nvidia delivered 10% greater performance at 1080p and a massive 20% at 1440p. The RX 7600 and RTX 4060 on the other hand were neck and neck at both tested resolutions, with just a few frames separating them at 1080p, and then nothing at 1440p. Likewise, the RTX 5060 and 9060 XT 8GB are also very evenly matched, with the Radeon GPU rendering just a few extra frames. So performance is close enough to call a tie in this one. Then we have the Ultra preset, and for the most part this data is very much one-sided, with Nvidia easily winning the majority of these matchups. The RTX 2060, for example, was a massive 26% faster than the 5600 XT at 1080p and then 18% faster at 1440p. The RTX 3060 can be seen leading the RX 6600 by a 15% margin at 1080p and then 23% at 1440p. The RX 7600 was more competitive with the RTX 4060, but even so the GeForce GPU was 9% faster at 1080p. Then we have the new kids on the block. The 9060 XT 8GB and RTX 5060, both were again neck and neck with no more than 1 to 2 FPS separating them. Rainbow Six Siege is another game that looks to have been largely dominated by Nvidia over the years. Using the medium preset, with the render scale manually adjusted to 100%, the RTX 2060 was 11% faster than the 5600 XT at 1080p, and then 9% faster at 1440p. The RTX 3060 completely mauled the RX 6600, delivering 26% greater performance at 1080p and a massive 33% more at 1440p. The RTX 4060 also defeated the RX 7600, rendering an additional 8% frames at 1080p and 1440p. Despite all of that though, the 9060 XT 8GB is able to outclass the RTX 5060, boosting performance at 1080p by 9% and then 10% at 1440p, so reasonable gains there. Switching to the Ultra Plus preset, the RTX 2060 ends up just 6% faster than the 5600 XT at 1080p and then 5% faster at 1440p. For the next gen though, AMD faces a serious blowout, with the RTX 3060 coasting to a 25% victory at 1080p and then 29% at 1440p. Somehow the RX 6600 goes from barely any faster than the 5600 XT at 1080p to slower at 1440p. Last generation's RX 7600 also trailed the RTX 4060, and as a result the GeForce GPU was 14% faster at 1080p and 9% faster at 1440p. And that brings us to the RTX 5060 versus 9060 XT 8GB matchup, and for this one, AMD gets the win, delivering 12% greater performance at 1080p and 7% at 1440p. Now, time for Space Marine 2, and here we have some interesting results. Firstly, the RTX 2060 smashes the 5600 XT, delivering 24% greater performance at 1080p and 13% at 1440p. The RTX 3060 again has the RX 6600's number, delivering an additional 11% performance at 1080p and 18% at 1440p. Then we have the RX 7600 and RTX 4060, and as is often the case, both are very evenly matched. The GeForce GPU though does have the upper hand at 1080p, where it was 6% faster, but at 1440p they both averaged 60 FPS. Interestingly, with the latest generation we see the opposite. The 9060 XT 8GB crushes the RTX 5060 at 1080p, delivering 17% better performance, only to end up neck and neck at 1440p, each rendering just over 80 FPS. Now, switching to the Ultra preset, we see that the 5600 XT can't handle the VRAM demands, and despite also only having 6GB of VRAM, the RTX 2060 does much better. Though truth be told, neither GPU is rendering the game correctly, so the fact that the 2060 is 21% faster at 1080p doesn't mean too much. Then we have the RX 6600, which gets embarrassed by the RTX 3060, as the GeForce GPU is not only able to render the game correctly, thanks to its 12GB of VRAM, but it was also 18% faster at 1080p. The RX 7600 and RTX 4060 matchup was interesting, because surprisingly the Radeon GPU was 6% faster at 1080p, though both were evenly matched at 1440p. Then we see a similar thing with the 9060 XT and RTX 5060, though the Radeon GPU does produce much better performance overall with much better 1% lows. The last game we're going to look at is an oldie, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and we'll start with the medium preset data. All of these GPUs can power through this game with ease, so it's a good one to look back on with these older models. Here we see that the RTX 2060 is 12% faster than the 5600 XT at 1080p and then 10% faster at 1440p. Surprisingly, the RX 6600 and RTX 3060 are more evenly matched. Here the GeForce GPU was just 6% faster at 1080p, though it was 12% faster at 1440p. Then we have the RX 7600 and RTX 4060, which are once again neck and neck, and we see a similar thing when comparing the RTX 5060 and 9060 XT 8GB, though the GeForce GPU was 4% faster at 1080p. Switching to the highest preset does knock down the older models to below 60 FPS at 1440p. The 5600 XT, for example, averaged just 55 FPS, making the RTX 2060 18% faster, while it was 22% faster at 1080p. The RTX 3060 was 15% faster than the RX 6600 at 1080p and 20% faster at 1440p, while the RTX 4060 was 8% faster than the RX 7600 at 1080p and 1440p. Then we have the current gen battle, the 9060 XT 8GB versus RTX 5060, and this is a rare example where the GeForce GPU was faster, delivering 8% greater performance at 1080p and 11% at 1440p. Okay, so here's a look at the 7-game average data, starting with the low to medium results. Across the games tested, the RTX 2060 wound up beating the 5600 XT by an 11% margin at 1080p and then 10% at 1440p. So it was comfortably ahead, meaning you'd want to be paying considerably less for the Radeon GPU in order to have considered it. It's a similar story with the RX 6600 versus RTX 3060 matchup. The GeForce GPU was 9% faster at 1080p and 15% faster at 1440p. Of course, the RX 6600 did end up selling for considerably less, but upon release both parts did share the same MSRP, so that's on AMD. Then we have the previous generation RX 7600 versus RTX 4060, and this matchup was a tie, both delivering near enough to identical performance overall, so no real winner there. Now the current battle appears to be won by AMD. The 9060 XT 8GB was on average 13% faster than the RTX 5060 at both tested resolutions, which is the largest win we've seen at the $300-ish price point for several years. Finally, we have the ultra quality data, and here the RTX 2060 was 11% faster than the 5600 XT at 1080p and 24% faster at 1440p. Then we have the RTX 3060 versus RX 6600 matchup, and the Radeon GPU gets mugged here, as the GeForce GPU was 19% faster at 1080p and 24% faster at 1440p. The RX 7600 and RTX 4060, on the other hand, are neck and neck with nothing separating them. As for the current generation battle, the 9060 XT 8GB ends up well in front, and is certainly helped by the VRAM limited Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered testing thanks to the additional PCIe lanes. In the end, the Radeon GPU was 22% faster at both tested resolutions, so an easy win here for AMD. The budget gaming GPU market has been underwhelming for a long time now, and it's in large part due to AMD's unwillingness to compete here. The 5600 XT was okay, but like I said, it arrived about a year late, and Nvidia was just able to discount the existing RTX 2060 and call it a day. So it was like a 14% price cut after about a year. That's pretty unexciting stuff. Wouldn't really have had you racing out to buy a 2060, and if that's the case, then how excited would you have been for the 5600 XT? Both products also only packed 6GB of VRAM, so again, neither of them I would say was terribly exciting. The next generation was even worse, but this was entirely due to the cryptocurrency boom, so a bit of a bust there. Still, if they were available at the MSRP, the RX 6600 would have been a bad joke. On that note though, I'm well aware that it was eventually heavily discounted down to a much more suitable price, around $200 US, but that wasn't the MSRP. I'm also sure some people will argue that the 6600 XT should have been compared to the RTX 3060, but remember, the 6600 XT's MSRP was nearly $400 US at $380, and if we we're going to include that model, then we should probably include the RTX 5060 Ti 8GB, as that MSRP is $380, and then if we we're going to include that, then why not go the extra $50 for the 16GB model, at which point we'd also be including the 16GB 9060 XT as well, along with half a dozen more products. So you have to stop somewhere, and for this content the target was $300 US, going as high as $330 during the cryptocurrency generation. The RX 7600 versus RTX 4060 comparison is much more straightforward, and it again speaks to the almost complete lack of any real competition from AMD, since probably the RX 580. At the time, FSR was vastly inferior to DLSS, as was the ray tracing support, though truth be told the 4060 sucks at ray tracing anyway, so a bit of a moot point there. But the upscaling component is important, so knocking just $30 off the price incentivized almost no one to go with the Radeon option, and rightfully so, it just wasn't enough. Apart from the measly $30 discount, so a 10% saving, the Radeon RX 7600 did nothing better than the RTX 4060. Both had 8GB of VRAM, and both delivered similar rasterization performance, though the Radeon GPU was typically a bit slower. Still, despite that, compared to the previous generations, AMD actually somehow managed to do more, which I suppose speaks to just how stagnant budget gaming has become. This latest go at it though is a little bit different. AMD's kind of pulled their finger out and is giving you a reason to buy Radeon. We might not be happy about 8GB graphics cards still being sold in 2025, and while we recommend you avoid them when possible, for those of you with just $300 to spend, there's really no better option than the 9060 XT. Better still though, despite the MSRP being set at $300, you can reliably buy them for less, with a number of models at the $270 to $280 US range. On the other hand, the generally slower RTX 5060 is available at the $300 US MSRP, generally making it more expensive despite being slower. You're also only getting 8 PCIe lanes, so the 9060 XT 8GB is the clear winner right now, and without question the best option for $300 US or less. As I was wrapping up this content, I noticed that some RTX 5060 Ti 8GB models are down at $340 US, though that's still a 25% premium over the discounted 9060 XT models, and they still only have 8 PCI Express lanes. The 16GB version, which is actually a good product, so that is the 16GB version of the RTX 5060 Ti, it's a good product, it costs $430 US. So although the performance is good and it's a pretty solid product, it is pretty expensive, but it does have a $430 US MSRP. And then we have the 16GB version of the 9060 XT, that's at $380 US, so a bit better there in terms of pricing. Probably the better buy of the two, though you could certainly make an argument for either model. Anyway, that's where we are in late 2025. The best option at $300 US, sadly, only has 8GB of VRAM, but surprisingly, it is a Radeon GPU. So there is that, I guess. They're starting to perhaps turn it around and help eliminate the stagnation we've seen over the last at least 3 generations. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. The like, subscribe thing, all the YouTube stuff. We also have the join button on Patreon if you want to become a member. You get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.